Ladies and gentlemen, I think you would agree with me that it would be unusual to find a congressman from Texas in the state of Alabama on a Saturday before the big election. But Dr. Ron Paul, our #1 defender of freedom in Washington, D.C., is hardly the usual congressman. First elected to Congress in 1976, Ron Paul has long been considered the nation's leading spokesman for limited government, sound money, free markets, and a non-interventionist foreign policy. Former Treasury Secretary William Simon called Dr. Paul the one exception to the gang of 535 on Capitol Hill. During his first stint in Congress, Ron Paul was a co-founder of the U.S. Gold Commission and the co-author of the Commission's minority report that called for the reestablishment of a gold standard in the United States. Dr. Paul was the first person in modern history to author term limit legislation and then lived under that legislation by stepping down from his seat in 1984 and returning to his medical practice. As a physician, Ron Paul has helped deliver over 4,000 babies. In 1988, Dr. Paul was the Libertarian Party candidate for the U.S. presidency. In 1996, Dr. Paul returned to Congress as a representative from Texas and continues to serve in that role today. For more than a quarter century, Dr. Paul has been voting against taxes and government spending. He advocates the abolition of the income tax and greatly reducing the size and power of government. Among Dr. Ron Paul's many honors, he received the Mises Institute Gross Close Prize and Leadership Award. Dr. Paul has written numerous books, including Challenge to Liberty and The Case for Gold, and he has established or helped establish many organizations for the promotion of liberty and good economic education, including the Ludwig von Mises Institute. And Dr. Paul is prominently listed on our Heroes of Freedom board in the amphitheater. Born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, Dr. Paul is a graduate of Gettysburg College and Duke University School of Medicine. He proudly served the United States as a flight surgeon in the U.S. Air Force. Dr. Paul and his wife Carol make their home in Surfside Beach, Texas. They are the parents of 5 children and the grandparents of 16 grandchildren. He is the distinguished counselor of the Ludwig von Mises Institute. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you Dr. Ron Paul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess I'm first challenged by questioning whether I should be here or not and the wisdom of not campaigning. But anyway, this is a lot more fun, I'll tell you that. People ask me what it's like being up in Washington, and let me tell you, it's a lot more fun getting out of Washington. It's a lot friendlier. Besides, when I make a statement in Washington, I don't get a reception like this. They have a little difficulty in understanding what really is going on, but really it is just great to be here. I want to thank so many of you because I see so many who have supported what I've done over the many years, and I appreciate that very much. And we are in the midst of a campaign at this time, and we don't know exactly what will happen there. And I may mention that a little bit more about that later on. But I do appreciate very much your support, and especially the support that you've given by being here and in the past for the Mises Institute. Because as a whole, I place very little importance on politicians. I don't think much of them. And that I am much more interested and much more confident that what happens in places like this and at the Mises Institute is going to have a much longer lasting effect, and is so much more important because ultimately it is education. But if you read Mises closely, he allows for activists in politics as well as those who educate, and he talks about those individuals who write and speak of sound theories, but he also talks about people who take those ideas and those ideologies and make them palatable for the general population. And he considered that very important, that it wasn't just something that was esoteric to be set aside at the universities, but it eventually has to become practical. And I strongly believe that, and I'm encouraged by what Mises had written in the past by that. But Lou Rockwell certainly deserves a tremendous amount of credit. This is my first visit here in many, many years, so the facilities are new and different. And I really am deeply impressed, Lou. I think you've done a great job. Lou was working for me back in the old days. Sometimes he admits it, sometimes he doesn't, but he was a government bureaucrat at one time. In the small amount of government that was legitimate, if we are going to have a government, at least we should have a Congress. Possibly, though, if we had our size government and we still had to have a Congress, maybe we could go back to the old days when they met about 2 months out of a year at the most, and then it could be legitimate. But Lou came to me when he had this idea about starting the Mises Institute, and I helped and encouraged him and helped get things started for him. But you know, it's been steady growth and steady improvement, and he's done a fantastic job. But he nearly did go astray one time on the Mises Institute. And a lot of you know about this, but I guess we really should try to forget about it. But it actually had a presence in D.C. for a while. And that was risky business, but he finally saw the light and saw the best thing in the world was to make sure he stayed out of inside the Beltway. And I don't think staying there would have corrupted the Mises Institute or Lou, but symbolically I think it's great. I think it's just great that the Mises Institute isn't inside the Beltway, if nothing else for symbolic reasons, because there are some good groups in Washington doing good work. But let me tell you that over the years, the longer they're there, somewhat like most politicians in Washington, the longer they're there, the worse they get. So at least that has not happened. I would say, if anything, the Mises Institute has not softened their stand. They have become more hardcore for the cause of liberty. You know, this past week we've had to deal with a week or two now, dealing with the sniper up in Washington, and you know it's rather amazing that we can't find this single sniper within our borders right outside our capital, and we're expected to find every terrorist in the world. So I'm not holding my breath on that, but you know, and it's also interesting that it's happening in places where guns are illegal. You know, this sniper is probably not only committing this heinous crime of killing people, but he's probably breaking a gun law, too. But there's nobody out there that might take care of this guy. And I'm just hoping that it never comes to Texas and it might build the case for owning guns, because believe me, there are a lot of guns in Texas and a lot of concealed guns, so maybe they wouldn't dare try that in Texas. Was a few months ago, I have a young lady that works for me. She does the campaign, and although she's had experience by working on farms and she's no softy, she doesn't come across that way. She's a very dignified lady. And but she was out on the campaign trail coming back, and we have a very rural district. She came back and she came upon a car, and the car was stopped, and there were two teenagers there stopped right in the middle of the road crying. They had just hit a deer, and the deer was almost dead. And they didn't know what to do. And they didn't have a cell phone, and she got out, and she took charge. And she said, "No problem, we'll take care of this." And she reassured them, calmed them down, got their telephone numbers, called their mothers, and told them what was happening. And then she promptly, you know, got out, grabbed that deer, dragged it off the side, pulled out her pistol, and put it out of its miseries. And I often thought about the image of that and how that would have sold up in Massachusetts someplace. But that generally is the image of our district. And our district is rural. It's mostly farming. The farm bureaus, they're not too interested in my voting pattern because, if you follow free market economics and the Constitution, it comes out that you don't vote for farm subsidies. You don't weigh how much and which ones and all that sort of thing. Farm subsidies are off limits. So I vote against all farm subsidies. And yet, and all the farm organizations, the farm bureaus and the different organizations, all campaign religiously against me. And people will say, well, why is it? Why do the farmers, we get 65% of the vote, why do those farmers vote for you? I said, well, they ask me about my vote, and I tell them, are you guys rich? No, we're poor. How long the program's been around? 70 years. And I said, well, who's getting richer? The rich farmers get richer, the poor farmers get poorer. And I said, then we go into other subjects, and they're interested in inheritance tax. And you know my position on that. No inheritance tax. How about the Second Amendment? You already know my Second Amendment position. How about fish and wildlife and environmental radicalism that come in and takes care of your land and you can't even dig a ditch without a federal permit? They hate that too. And so it's on. And when you go directly to the farmers, even though they have been kowtowed into believing that they have representation that's going to take care of them, I believe sincerely that if you present these messages in a political way to them and are honest and upfront with them, that they will come our way. And that really is the challenge, that whole idea of making our ideas palatable. And the subject for the talk today, of course, is an Austrian in Washington. And it does raise a lot of questions up there because, quite frankly, they look at me when I vote by myself. I think in the last 2 years, there was a time or two, like 78 times. The New York Times called me on that, and they said, we're doing a little article about this, and they said, we added it up, and you did it. They gave me the number because I didn't know the number, and they said, we found out that you voted by yourself more times than the whole Congress put together. And they wonder, they said, I don't know how you get reelected. They confess and they say, we agree with you, or I agree with what you're doing there, but I can't take that chance. I got to get back here so I can save the country. So they don't. They know better very often, and yet they are frightened and intimidated. They don't have confidence, and they just believe that they really believe they'll do the country more good by preaching our message and leading in our direction and voting our way when they can, but not to take any risk or vote on principle each time. Most of the time they vote on principle, but not every time is the way they would explain it. But being from the Austrian school and understanding a little bit about economics, it is a different place. There's no doubt about it. And the question is, what is it like up there? If you take the members of Congress, 435, a few missing at the moment, but I would say, including the 535, I would say that there's probably less than a half a dozen who even have the vaguest idea what Austrian economics is all about. I mean, they're not hostile, but they're not sympathetic, but they're not knowledgeable. They have no idea. I mean, they're not there because they're even interested in economics. Most of them are there because they're interested in a job, and they like the prestige of the job, and they love being able to be astute in making an interpretation of political events and how to cast votes here and paint themselves back at home, and they get a sense of satisfaction from this. So that you could look at that as negative, but you could look at it as a positive. Maybe if they're not at least hostile, they will at least be open to it. And they'll be open to it when the people are for it. When the farm bureaus come to Washington to promote Austrian economics, the members of Congress will be for the Austrian economic policy on farming. So that's why ultimately the education is important. And I don't worry about that. I think that's just the way it's going to be. I don't think the solution is that we'll pick away and eventually have a majority of libertarian thinking, free market people into Congress, and all of a sudden we're going to gradually repeal the laws and go to a free market. I don't think it's going to happen that way. I think it takes a change in attitudes, around the country. But since it is lonely, and occasionally I have to converse with somebody that knows something about Austrian economics, there's one person I can always go to because he does know it, and that's my friend Alan Greenspan. And we talk about it occasionally, and sometime in committee. And he claims that I just have. He claims that he too has a nostalgia for the gold standard. But he wrote that famous article in the Objectivist newsletter when he was with Rand, and I guess maybe that's when Murray knew him back in those days. But he wrote this wonderful article on freedom and liberty and the gold standard, and really explained the Depression rather well and how bad the Federal Reserve was. So one day we had a little session and we got together, and it was more social because we were going to have our pictures made. So I had the original copy of that article in 1966. It was a faded copy, and it was this little green booklet, and I took it, and when I had my few minutes with him, I said, "Do you recognize this book?" He said, "Oh, yes, he does." And I said, well, then I flipped it open, and I said, "Do you remember this article?" And he said, "Yeah, I do. I said, "Would you sign this article for me?" So he took his pen out and he scribbled it, and as he was writing, I said, "Would you like to write a disclaimer?" And he declined. He said that he had just, this is the amazing part of the story, he says, "No," he says, "I don't want to." He says, "I've read this recently, and I endorse every single word in it." Figure it out. I don't know. But one of the questions I get asked most, and I was asked maybe several times already at this meeting, people are curious. They're very pleased with what I do and get elected. But the question that comes up so often is, how do you get reelected? Just what is. And you have to have, politics are important, and our beliefs are important, and what I tell the farmers are important, and these great speeches I give, they're very important. But you also have to have some secret weapons. And that's pretty important. It might be more important than my speeches. And my secret weapon's over here, my wife Carol. And very seriously, she claims she doesn't know anything about politics. One time when I first announced many years ago about running for Congress, and it was in an area that was all Democrats. This was way back. And she said, "Well, why in the world would you want to do that?" And I said, "Well, I just want to talk about economics. Now I'm an expert. Nobody else will listen to me. Maybe they'll have to listen to me if I campaign." So she said, "I don't know. That'd be dangerous if you do that." I said, "What do you mean? How could it be dangerous running for Congress?" She said, "Well, you could end up getting elected." But I assured her that could not be possible because I was not making any of those promises, and I had a different approach to politics. But her inexperience had her analyze this and say, "Well, I think the people are going to be anxious to hear somebody tell the truth." And, there's probably a lot of truth to that, because people who vote for me and support me probably are a lot like the members of Congress in Washington. They probably don't know what Austrian economics is. The hardcore worker and the supporter, and the ones that will knock on doors do, but the average voter doesn't know. And that's important to get people out to work. But the other individuals do want to trust. They want to trust. They want to know generally. They want to like a person, and they want to know something about their family. So some of it's what we might assume superficial. But Carol says it's not superficial. They have a right to know about your family and your kids. So several members here already today came up and said, "Thanks for the cookbook." So she does a cookbook. She gets more people asking her for a signature on the cookbook than I get when I go out there. So, but it's family stuff, and there's pictures of kids and all that. And again, I think it's all part of the advice of making making ourselves as well as our ideas palatable to the general public. So the trust factor, I do believe the country is starved for trust, and there is such disdain for the politician that inevitably each of my opponents, when they announce, they say, we have to get rid of Ron Paul, and I'm running and said, he is out of step with Washington. So that after they make their announcement, I'll get letters and phone calls. We love it. You're out of step with Washington. So hopefully we'll continue to do that. But there are days that are disheartening. People say, aren't you awful frustrated being up there among that den of thieves and crooks and criminals? And no, I don't even get frustrated. I get exasperated, or other words I could use, but not true frustration. Frustration indicates that you're anticipating positive results, and I have very low expectations for that point. I just don't expect that I'm going to change the world or the country, and I decided that you might as well have as much fun doing it as possible, and still with the idea that ultimately the change comes from changing ideas, and then the other will come later. So I'm a fish out of water, and I do my best with it, and try my best to make the most of it in a positive sense in a positive sense. But you know, I think we have been losing, no doubt. We're losing in Washington. I'm not certain we're losing outside of Washington. Matter of fact, I'm encouraged when I get outside of Washington. But this is, I think, Lou's favorite magazine that I'm going to quote here. I think this is going to be Weekly Standard. Is that one of your favorite? I want to read this quote from the Weekly Standard. And this, matter of fact, was this year, February this year, to tell you a little bit about what the opposition is thinking about. And it says, President Bush has broken the libertarian grip on the GOP. Did you know that? But now this is true. He says, not only did he call for a grand foreign policy mission, he called for expanding Head Start and liberalizing welfare benefits for immigrants. But there is still some way to go. And that's where the opposition is, yes. The little bit of rhetoric that sounded about less government in 1994, I guess they're probably right on that, but I would hardly call that the libertarian grip on the Republican Party. But it is an attitude. But I believe the real victor, philosophically and politically, that has occurred here in the last several years has been the vindication of Scoop Jackson. Now, Scoop Jackson, anybody remember him? Senator from Washington, I believe. Now, Scoop Jackson wins because Scoop Jackson is the opposite of a libertarian, a constitutionalist, because he believed in never denying a penny, not for defense, but never denying a penny for the military. And he never denied a penny for the welfare state. So he did exactly the opposite, and that's more or less what we have now in the administration, coming out of the Republican pseudo-revolution of 1994, and now we have it endorsed by both parties overwhelmingly. So I guess those of us who had some sympathies for Andrew Jackson, it looks like Scoop Jackson won. And hopefully we will someday be able to reverse this. But you know, the system works probably every bit as bad as you suspect. Not too long ago, they had discovered that there were several $100,000 placed in a bill for a bicycle trail in Alexandria. You know, a good federal project. And I live in Alexandria, so my staff comes to me and they say, hey, did you get this money in here for your bicycle trail? No, not me. I like to ride bikes, but I didn't do that. So they decided they'd look around. They went to the congressman whose district it was in. And they asked him, and he says, well, I don't know where it came from. And he didn't. So they finally figured out it came from a congressman from Arizona. And they went to this guy and he said, well, I don't know anything about it. I'm from Arizona. Why would I put money in there? But it turns out that the staffer for the guy in Arizona was a bicycle rider, and he lived in Alexandria, and he stuck it in the dark of night, and nobody knew it was there until they finally spent the money. And you wonder why the budget's not under control? But that's only a couple $100,000, right? Now that's the way the whole thing works. This a week or two ago, we had a continuing resolution. Continuing resolutions are pretty bad, but they're not the worst because they maintain everything at current levels. And of course, you know, if you did that for a long period of time and never raised a thing, you know, we'd probably work our way out of this. But, you know, if cost of living and all these other things and population growth, everything has to grow. But this continuing resolution was what was called not clean. It was not a clean resolution. It had something stuck in it. And the special interest that was stuck in there was, now this was important. I'm sure you called your congressman to make sure he voted for this. But they put this in at the last minute, last second, no printed version. You could read it on the internet. And it was $3.8 billion of a special loan to Poland. Now that's important, especially if you're from Polish extraction. I mean, I'm sure you'd be for it then. $3.8 billion for the Poland to buy airplanes. You figure, well, why did the Democrats not scream if they're trying to subsidize a big company? I think Lockheed and some other companies were going to benefit. The reason is very simple, is union labor. And big business are together, they're partners, and they slip that kind of money in, and they get their fascism. And that's what it's all about. And that's how the system really works. And I think that's how most of the military-industrial complex works. It's usually subsidizing and supporting the large interests. This week, I think there's been like $8 billion promised to Republican allies, the insurance companies. Well, you know, the market won't carry the weight of insurance against terrorism, so insurance won't work. We have to bail them out. Republican allies, the airline companies, bail them out to the tunes of tens of billions of dollars. So it is endless. Its spending is endless, and it never seems to slow up. And I think we have embarked on something that will soon get out of control. Soon, I don't know exactly how to define that, but I don't think it's 20 years off. I think we are going to have some type of an economic cataclysmic event that will make the system less functionable, maybe not function at all, because we are able to cover our bases so much with all these projects and these spending, but ultimately the test will be on the dollar, because I do not believe the dollar can forever be burdened with all these bills. The world still trusts the dollars. The dollar is still relatively strong, and yet you can't print money forever. So this something is going to happen. So it's not going to be because of my speeches. And unfortunately, it's not going to be because we have ultimately reached the test and reached enough people to educate them to send up that message. But it's going to stop, and it's going to be difficult, and there's going to be havoc. But the challenge is that we have more and more allies like this group out there understanding. And this is where I am encouraged. The more people I meet, even at this conference, professors that are teaching around the country, where were you in 1950s? You weren't there. I went through college and high school in the 50s and medical school in the 50s, and I got my information basically from the Foundation for Economic Education. And that was the great influence. But today there are many, many more, so although we cannot avert it, and Alan Greenspan, I think, right now believes he can. I think he believes in some of his own, some of this own image making. He's a knight and all these kind of things. So he believes that he can keep this afloat. He believes in his own heart, I believe, that he can do it. Although he knows that there has to be the correction and the liquidation, I think he is under the belief that he can allow that to happen gradually and steadily without a collapse by maintaining certain segments of the economy, pumping up with low interest, telling the people it's their patriotic duty to spend money, keep the consumer booming along. If they don't have enough money, that they can refinance their house, and they continue to refinance by even the Fed getting involved in Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae mortgages, and that the housing boom and the consumer boom will keep things going, limping along, and the correction will occur. The only thing is, he hasn't looked at recent history by a country that did not allow the correction, and they're as in much trouble as they've been 20 years ago, and that's Japan. So I think he should go back, read his article more seriously, and take it to heart. That's not likely to happen. I think that we're more likely to see some very serious problem. What is it that I get the question asked? What is it that I think motivates those people who go to Washington, and the people who really promote the philosophy that we see as doing so much harm? And I think the biggest motivation is that of course, being in office. And those behind the scenes, it's power and control. People and wealth, control the wealth of the world. When it comes to foreign policy, I think this is very, very clear, at least to my mind. When I first went to Washington in the 1970s, I imagine I was more intently interested in monetary policy and economics. And I got on the banking committee and worked on the gold standard and other things. And I'm still very interested in that because I think ultimately an economy doesn't work without sound money. But when I went back, by the time I went back in 96, I first went in 76. When I went back in 96, I had become much more interested in the connection between international finance, monetary policy, and foreign affairs and war. And it was for that reason I was motivated for two reasons to go back: the economic, financial, as well as international relations. Now, when I got there in 97, I asked to be put on international relations. And the staff, the Republican leadership looked and they said, well, that's no problem. That's a minor committee compared to Ways and Means and Rules Committee and Appropriations, where all the big money's passed out. You couldn't get that, but you could get on. Banking is not considered one of the big ones, real big. And then, but international relations is supposed to be very easy. The next day they came back and they said, you can't be on. I said, well, why can't I be on? You told me just yesterday that it was an easy committee. They said, yes, but it was discussed and the subject came up, and they said that you probably wouldn't vote for any foreign aid. And they said, is that true? I said, absolutely true. I wouldn't vote for any foreign aid. They said, well, that's why we can't let you on. So after 4 years, though, with a little bit of pressure and maneuvering, and then they learned to figure out how nice guy I was. They put me on international relations. Of course, this is a huge event, an important issue now, dealing with the war. There was to be no war resolution brought to the committee, and we agitated to make sure they brought it to the committee. We wanted to have some hearings. The Senate had hearings, and they were biased hearings. We had 1 day of hearings, and it was done by Wolfowitz and Pearl to come and tell us why we had to go to war. None of our witnesses who would have suggested that maybe we don't need to go to war, they weren't allowed to be there. And then the resolution was finally written and suggested, and they said, well, we're going to bypass the committee. With a little more agitation, we made them bring it through the committee. And that was a few weeks ago. Now, I had an amendment. My amendment was a substitute amendment because I wanted to make the point that this bill did nothing but transfer power and responsibility from the legislative branch to the President and to the United Nations. That was the point I wanted to make. The resolution mentioned the United Nations 25 times. It never mentioned Article 1, Section 8 or the Constitution once. And it essentially did two things. It transferred power to the President to wage war when and if he wanted to against Iraq. At the same time, he was instructed to carry out UN resolutions against Iraq. Of course, there are 100 and some resolutions that have been written that have never been followed before, but that was his job. And my substitute amendment said that it was written up as a declaration of war. And I introduced that with the statement that what my main objection is to, and that I felt certain that they would be sure to make sure this resolution would be defeated. So we had a vote on it, and everybody voted against it. But what happened in between was interesting, because the chairman of the committee, used to be chairman of the judiciary, now he's chairman of international relations, Henry Hyde, he explained to me in a condescending way that this was nothing more, this part of the Constitution was nothing more than an anachronism, and that we should just forget about this. And his partner in this crime against the people, Tom Lantos, said, yes, not only that is what I think you're doing, member of Congress, member of, from Texas, is that you are pursuing something quite frivolous. So it is anachronistic, it's frivolous, and then we had one other member hit me on the third one, that he said, Congressman, don't you realize how impractical it is to have a declaration of war these days? It affects trade agreements, it affects contracts and insurances, and it's just impractical. And I says, I certainly do. I says, that's the reason going to war is not supposed to be easy. But those were the three challenges: anachronism, frivolous, and impractical, because it's inconvenient for some people to call a war. And of course, you can't call a war because the one goal, I believe, that undermines all this is not only to move from state government to the federal government, from the legislative branch to the executive branch, but it's to move it to the one world order, the United Nations. And this to me, I think is their biggest goal, is to make sure, and even the pretense that they weren't enthusiastic about the United Nations, and now they still talk about unilateralism. Isn't it ironic that when they speak of unilateralism, there's a grain of truth about us minding our own business and doing what we think is necessary and proper for ourselves, but done in the tone of, you know, you either do what we tell you or we're going to go and start the war all by ourselves. What a choice that we have. Fortunately, though, I think the American people are even more astute than what the Republicans think they are right now. I think the economy is going to play a role in this next election. But I did get a lot of political grief from that, from close supporters, long-term allies, and friends of the presidents, the Republican hierarchy. And their main argument, they would always nod their head and say, I agree with you, on all this UN stuff. But their main argument was, well, why we have to give the president support. He's our president. If you don't support him, it looks like you're with the Democrats. And they put a lot of pressure. So it'll be very interesting dealing with this, you know, in a practical political sense. I was able and have been able to handle farm issues and other things that look like on the surface that I'm not voting for their interest. But we'll see what happens, because we get a lot of letters from Democrats and those who are independents who say, thank goodness for somebody who will stand up, and we're especially pleased because you're from Texas and willing to do that. So in many ways, the election will be a referendum on some of these ideas. I see my election as being different. Not significant because of me, because the job is insignificant in the personal sense. I don't need that job for that reason. But I see it as being very important that I don't lose an election, that I don't even lose a percentage. The first time I won this second go-around in 96, I had 51%. It went to 55. It went to 60. So here's another challenge. You know, we have a new district, a lot of new people, so there's a lot of things that we have to take into consideration. But it doesn't go unnoticed. They know I vote differently. They're beginning to hear the message and understand it. So if I, you know, with this, say this war vote, if my vote drops from 60 down to 53, yeah, I'm still elected and I go to Washington, but it's not a very good victory, because it will be construed, see what's happening? He's taken too many chances. But can you see the importance of a vote of endorsement in a popular sense, that they will, in that particular district, vote and rubber stamp and put a stamp of approval on someone that's willing to take the stands and stand for limited government and the rule of law. So that is what motivates me to do my very best. And believe me, although I am here today, between now and the election day, we are going to be very busy. Because fortunately for you, we're not going to be in session until after the election. But you know, that used to be said, and most of the time we wish that were true. But government is so much out of control. You know, when you think about what the executive branch can do and the agencies of governments can do and the writing of regulations and what courts can do, we don't have enough protection. But hopefully the election will send some messages to the Congress that maybe that we don't have to rush off into this war. The motivation for the war, I guess everybody has a theory on that. From my viewpoint of having been in Washington and listening to these guys promote the war, I think it's a mixture of things. I think the one thing it doesn't have anything to do with, this I'm convinced of, it has nothing to do with national security. I don't think it has anything to do. Matter of fact, the strongest argument can be made is that what we're doing there is a threat to our security. Nationally, a true defense is injured. We spend money, we waste money, we build up enemies, we spread ourselves too thin. I mean, all the arguments. So if you want strong defense and a national security, you believe in that, the last thing we need to do is be going over there and institutionalizing something they've been practicing off and on for years, but they're institutionalizing like they've never done before. And that is this concept, and they put it in a positive light, preemptive war, as if it's a wonderful thing. In the United States of America, we're coming with the traditions of Jefferson and Madison about non-entangling alliance and staying out of the internal affairs. Now, I get chastised by my own party by saying you don't give the president enough support for preemptive war. I mean, something has to happen on that. We cannot let that stand, but that's really what the challenge is all about. What is it about if it has nothing to do about national security? Well, if I had to put my finger on the top issue, I would say that it's oil. I think it's control of oil. And if I had to prove that, I can't, but that's just my sense. That's what I believe. But I think very close to that is something even harder to identify, but maybe more sinister. And that is the attitude and the philosophy and the warmongerism of the neocons, who almost want war for the sake of war, who want empire for the sake of empire. And they do it because they believe they're doing the Lord's work, that they're doing justice for the world. They don't even see themselves as challenging something good, but they're promoting something good. And that they're going to institutionalize, you know, wonderful new government. But deep down in their hearts, you know, they can't be honest about that either. Because they talk about democracy. They want to get democracy in Iraq. Well, what would happen if there was democracy in Saudi Arabia or Kuwait? The Ayatollah would win, or, you know, Osama bin Laden would win the election. So they have no interest in democracy and democratic election. I think it's this combination of empire for the sake of empire as well as oil for the sake of controlling their oil probably motivates them the most. And they like it, and they enjoy it, and they believe they are on a true mission. Very briefly, I want to talk about the events right after 9/11, dealing with security, because you know we've had umpteen pieces of legislation. I think there's about 15 significant pieces of legislation that has passed. The regular routine business of appropriation bills was totally ignored, but 15 major pieces of legislation. And none of them, I believe, are any benefit to you. And it's all been a challenge to your liberties, a challenge to your pocketbook, and a challenge to national security, and does nothing to promote internal security in this country. The main reason why we had 9/11, of course, the background information, the reasons would probably deal with our foreign policy and the building up of our enemies. But the shorter, more pertinent reason why that happened had to do with our lack of understanding and lack of defense and determination that property rights are important. Not property rights, your right to own and control your property and defend your property. That has been neglected. And it's neglected not by the property owner, not by the government taking away from the property owner, but it's the property owner that doesn't want the responsibility, and that's the airlines. They don't want responsibility and liability. And since 9/11, they're passing more to the government. But you know, if they'd have had just a little bit more respect for the Second Amendment, along with some property rights, 9/11 would have been long forgotten because it would have been over in about 30 minutes and we'd have had 19 guys probably shot. And that is, the guns should have been in the cockpit of those airplanes, and the airlines should have been responsible for defending their citizens. So the question is, are we moving in that direction? Unfortunately not. We're moving away from it. We're turning the responsibility over to the government. Within the first week, the debate on the House floor about security at airports occurred in a political atmosphere. There were two groups vying for control. The special interest companies that would get the contract that the Republicans would allow, or we would federalize the workers. Had nothing to do with the airlines assuming the responsibility. So even the Republicans lost on that, and it became federalization of the workers and unionization of the workers, and of course a step away from the concept of the Second Amendment. Fortunately, though, the district that I'm in responds the way you have when it has to do with the Second Amendment and your responsibility to defend yourself and your property. So that is very good. The attitude that we've had over all these years, both on property as well as contracts, really contributes so much to the problems that we have. And that's why ultimately we have to have a reassessment, not only in the political sense and the little things that I do, but in a major sense of teaching a whole new generation about what this is all about. And I have the core of my campaign workers in my district are made up of homeschoolers. And I think that is not an accident. I think that is very real. They first understand the Constitution and limited government and contracts, and they'll come out and they'll work hard. And yet the people throughout the district that don't agree with that still see it as a challenge for the right to life homeschoolers who do promote this. But ultimately, we have to reach people in a deep conviction of what freedom is all about. What is the purpose of all that we do? Indirectly, you're related here. Directly, I am. And that is in political activity. If we want people's minds to be changed, it is a political activity. What should be the purpose of political activity? I think there should be only one goal of all political activity, and that is to strive for liberty in the true sense of the word. Now, you can't strive for liberty unless you have an understanding of where liberty comes from and what it means. Is it a collective liberty? Are there such things as women's rights and minority rights and all this kind of stuff? No. There's only one kind of liberty and only one kind of right, and that's an individual right. For me, it comes about in a very deep philosophic and a religious belief that individuals are very important, that we have been created by our Creator, that we get our life and our liberty from our God, and that if we are to have a government, it should be very, very limited in protecting our right to live and live as we see fit, as long as we don't hurt other people. And that to me is the whole goal. And our enemies will say, well, you don't solve any problems. How are you going to take care of the poor? And that's where we lose the argument so often, because we lose the moral high ground. They grab the moral high ground because they care about people, and they're going to feed them and clothe them and give them education. Well, soon, even now, we can tell them their results aren't all that good. And when we get our bankruptcy, we'll prove their results are really lousy. So that's why we have to have something to replace it with. And it has to be a belief and a conviction that freedom works. And it has to be a conviction that if you do believe in freedom, you do believe in the individual, that you are a compassionate person, in that if you care about your fellow man, if you care about the well-being of people, you will argue for freedom. And that there will be more prosperity, more people eating, more people housed, more medical care if we go that way. But we don't win that fight. That is the one that we really lose. And whether it makes you uncomfortable or not in politics, it's a real argument that you have to address. That you have to be concerned about your fellow man. And we have to tell them and explain to them why our options are correct. And believe in it and explain how they work. That is my goal. That should be all of our goals. I would like to finish now with a quote that James Kilpatrick wrote about me quite a few years ago. I was the Libertarian Party candidate in 1988. He came to see me. I was in Washington at the time, and we sat down for an hour and had lunch. I remember it very vividly at the table in the Capitol. And he wrote a nice piece afterwards. And it's a little bit contradictory, but I think it makes a very important point. And I think it involves all of us, not just me. Kilpatrick says, the interesting thing is that Ron Paul believes. He truly believes. He believes in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and he believes that society prospers when the people rely on their own resources first and look to the government last. He regards politicians as a breed of hypocrites who are in favor of economy until an economy affects their constituents. In the newspaper business, we seldom meet true believers. It is therefore a refreshing experience to spend an hour talking with Paul. Viewed in the real world, his proposals are preposterous, impossible, unachievable. And yet, the gentleman makes uncomfortably good sense. Thank you very much.